It began in the spring of 1877 with a journey into the unknown.
She said we couldn't take a wagon, we couldn't take a horse, we couldn't take anything. And we walked.
In a place far from home, a father made a promise to his dying son. To keep that promise, he would challenge the government in a trial unlike any other in American history.
Would you be asked if you were a human being in order to achieve your legal rights?
Nombe te hihate ewaki gumbaji. I am a man. The same God made us both.
Funding for this program was provided by the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux Community, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Jane L. Johnson Family, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Union Pacific is honored to serve the 7,000 communities in our system, the same communities we call home. Because where we have tracks, we have ties. Union Pacific, proud sponsor of Standing Bear's Footsteps.
America 1900. The frontier is gone, but in the earliest motion pictures, the myth of the Wild West lives on. On the plains of Nebraska, an old man lights his pipe and watches the river go by. The Wild West he remembers is nothing like the one in the movies. He is Machunaze, Standing Bear in the Ponca language. In the old days, he wore a necklace made from the claws of a grizzly bear. Once, Chief Standing Bear was famous across America. Now he lives quietly, where the Niobrara River flows into the Missouri. He's traveled thousands of miles, many on foot, to return to this place. The Standing Bear Bridge, which spans the Missouri, is named for him.
You have to remember who you are, where you came from, who your people were.
As descendants of Ponca Chief Standing Bear, Janet Size and her grandson Gabriel feel powerfully tied to this landscape.
This is our home. This is our ancestral home. This is where my mother's people, both on her father and her mother's side, called home. And to me, whenever I come back here, I get that feeling of home, that this is where I want to be. And I've told my children this is where I want to rest.
Lewis and Clark were among the first white men to see a Ponca village. In the late summer of 1804, they passed the white chalk cliffs of the Missouri and climbed the Ponca's green hills. The tribe's earth lodges were deserted because the people were out hunting buffalo.
Well, they'd been there a long time at the mouth of the Niobrara, since the 1730s. The graves were on the bluffs above the villages, and Indians believed that the ancestors lived on in those locations. The attachment of Native Americans was to a place, and much more than us. I mean, we move so frequently, we can't be attached to a place that much. And we take our religion with us when we leave, and we take our history with us when we leave. It's immaterial. But you remove Indians out of their homeland, and you remove them from their history as well as their geography, because their history is written in the landscape.
Standing Bear and his brother Big Snake were born in the Niobrara Valley sometime in the early 1830s. The Ponca were fierce hunters and warriors who counted their wealth in horses. But their world was changing fast. When Standing Bear was a child, artist George Catlin came up the Missouri with paint and canvas, capturing portraits of Native people along the way. He painted a Ponca chief named The Smoke, who told him that whiskey and smallpox had destroyed 4/5 of his tribe. Big Elk, chief of the Omaha, had been to Washington and had seen the white man's power. He warned his people that a great flood was coming. If they and their Ponca cousins wanted to survive, they would have to adapt.
This whole idea of what happens west of the Mississippi River is about adaptation and survival. If you don't adapt, you don't survive.
For the Ponca and the Omaha, survival meant adopting the white man's way. They learned to build log houses. Some even converted to Christianity. They gave up hunting buffalo and learned to grow corn and wheat.
Exactly what Thomas Jefferson wanted. He wanted these lands to be filled with sturdy, self-sufficient, independent people who could live off the land. And little did he know those people were already here. They were called Ponca.
But the far more numerous Lakota, known as the Sioux, held on to their buffalo culture. In 1876, they would defeat Custer at the Little Bighorn. They had no respect for a tribe of farmers.
The Lakota would come down on raids from these hills that surround us, and they would go into the fields and they would kill women and they would kill men and they would scalp them and they would get word back, we're not going to allow you to adopt the white ways. If you want to act like women, we're going to treat you like women. We'll kill you.
In 1868, the U.S. government signed a treaty with the Lakota, giving them the Black Hills. By mistake, the Ponca homeland, protected by treaty, was included in the Lakota reservation. There were fewer than 1,000 Ponca left, and rather than anger the Sioux, the government ordered the military to send the peaceful tribe 600 miles south to a place called Indian Territory. They didn't go without a fight. Standing Bear and his brother Big Snake were put in chains and imprisoned for refusing to follow the white man's orders. Standing Bear told the soldiers he had done nothing wrong.
This land is mine. God gave it to me. If I want to sell it, I'll tell you. If you spoke to a white person like this and treated him like this, he would kill you. I don't want to do that kind of thing. I don't want to fight any white person, but this land is mine. I will make my home here. Leave now.
10 days later, Standing Bear and Big Snake were forced to join their people on the long walk into the unknown.
Imagine if in the United States, in your town where you live, that the Martians landed and they had their own clothes, they had their own language, they had their own foods, and they were going to take what you had, and you were going to become a Martian in order to survive.
In May of 1877, the Ponca people began a journey their descendants have not forgotten.
My grandpa was 8 years old on that forced removal. My sister-in-law talks about the young guys, little boys that were picked up by their braids and flung into the back of wagons by the soldiers when they arrived. Just like you'd pick up a chicken that you're going to wring its neck and throw to the side, just in heaps, grab them by their hair and fling them in wagons as they go through the village.
Lewis Hedman's grandmother was a young woman when the soldiers came.
She said he couldn't fight back because the men didn't have any guns. If they had, she said, we would have fought back. And she said, from there we walked. We had no clothing to take with us. We couldn't take a wagon. We couldn't take a horse. We couldn't take anything. And we walked. And we walked day after day.
The 55-day journey began cold and wet, the rivers overflowing. Near the town of Neely, Nebraska, a baby girl died. Her name was White Buffalo Girl.
The agent went and found the town carpenter and asked if he could make a cross, a wooden cross for White Buffalo Girl. And the next morning, May 24th, they had a graveside ceremony on the top of a knoll at Laurel Hill Cemetery that overlooks the Elkhorn River and the Elkhorn River Valley. And the father of that baby, who has lost his home, has now lost his baby girl. And yet, the bayonets of the cavalry are at his back. He can't stay here. He doesn't even have time to grieve. So he does the only thing he can think of. He asks the townspeople of Neely, he begs them to take care of that baby girl in his absence, to treat White Buffalo Girl, his daughter, as though she were one of theirs. And for 131 years, the white settlers of Neely have honored that pledge.
Soon after the death of White Buffalo Girl, Standing Bear lost his own daughter. On June 6th, Prairie Flower died of tuberculosis and was given a Christian burial near the town of Milford, Nebraska. Standing Bear and his wife, Zazeta, now had an orphan grandson to raise. The further south they came, the more terrifying the weather. Tornadoes attacked them twice. Many believed that the spirits were angry and the end of the world was at hand. On July 9th, the Ponca arrived at their new reservation in present-day Oklahoma. It was hot. The land was bleak and stony, impossible to farm.
There wasn't any place prepared for us here. There wasn't homes. There wasn't teepees. There wasn't a place to grow a garden. There wasn't anything anywhere.
A third of the Ponca tribe died that year of malaria, hunger, and exhaustion. A few years later, when they moved to a new reservation in Indian Territory, they would build a cemetery on a hill.
This area here was the only hill of any height in the area. And our people were so lonesome for their homelands, for their ancestral ways, that they wanted a place where when they went back to the Mother Earth, that they would still be facing this way towards the north, to be able to look to the ancestors, to be able to look at the homelands, to be able to feel as if there was something that was sharing between those that they left behind or lost on the forced walk down here.
Definitely a political vibe. You feel that the hill, it's pretty hustle and bustle, and then when they're out on recess, it gets a little bit slower. So everything is dictated by what's going on in Congress, I think.
Katie Morgan is an Indian rights attorney in Washington, D.C., at one of the largest law firms in the world. Her specialty is American Indian law and policy.
This is Katie.
Morgan is Northern Ponca.
I'm good, how are you?
Her family descends from one of 9 Ponca chiefs, Smokemaker, exiled to Indian Territory along with Standing Bear.
I didn't really think about the law until I was in my senior year of college, actually. I thought I wanted to do social work. I knew that I wanted to do something for my tribe and for Native people. I really didn't think about law until I took a constitutional law class at the university. And the more I thought about it and the more people I spoke with, they really thought law was the area that you can change people's lives on a day-to-day basis.
Today, Native American tribes are sovereign nations. But in Standing Bear's time, Indians were legally wards of the government, urged to think of the president as their great father.
Because the tribes were uncivilized, as the court saw in their eye, and didn't practice, white ways, then they could come up with a way to be the guardian to the tribes.
Back in Indian Territory, the Ponca people were increasingly desperate. Perhaps it was time to meet the Great Father. Perhaps he would allow them to return to their homeland. In November of 1877, Standing Bear and 8 other Ponca chiefs took the train to Washington, D.C. Most of the Indian delegations who came to Washington had their portraits taken, and these images of so-called noble savages sold well to the public. The Ponca chiefs posed before a studio backdrop. Katie Morgan's ancestor, Smokemaker, Chief Standing Bear, his brother Big Snake, White Eagle, head chief of all the Ponca people. The chiefs stayed at a hotel. They went to a play and ate at restaurants.
It's fascinating to keep putting yourself in their shoes and to imagine what they're seeing through their eyes. Eyes that were used to seeing river valleys and vast expanses of the prairie with going days without seeing another person.
The Ponca chiefs met with President Rutherford B. Hayes at the White House. They told him that Indian Territory was for them a place of death. Big Chief said it best, "I was taken up by a whirlwind. Now we are all perishing." Their stories shocked the president. The Indian agent, authorized to interact with the Ponca on behalf of the government, had reported that all was well.
Well, there was bad intelligence in handling the American Indian situation in the frontier era. The people who were supposed to be able to provide that intelligence, the Indian agents who were on the ground, gave bad information. That information was passed up the line. So you had clueless bureaucrats making these decisions on bad intelligence that ended up costing thousands and thousands of lives.
The chiefs left Washington with gifts and a promise from the president to help them. As he said, they had no blood on their hands. But he had no intention of letting them return to Nebraska. The official policy of the U.S. government was to fill Indian Territory with as many Indians as possible.
Do you suppose that had anything to do with the gold that was discovered in the Black Hills? Or do you suppose it had anything to do with the railroad they were trying to put across the land so they could get to the gold in California? Do you suppose it had anything to do with the amazing amount of immigrants that were coming across the oceans and wanted their own space? We know that now.
Soon after their return to Indian Territory, President Hayes made good on his promise. The Ponca were allowed to choose a new reservation. Less than 200 miles west at the fork of the Salt and Arkansas rivers, they found what they wanted. It reminded them a little of their Nebraska homeland. That winter, Standing Bear's son came down with malaria. When he was dying, the boy asked his father to make a promise to take his body home. On the night of March 30th, 1879, reporter Thomas Tibbles is putting to bed the next edition of the Omaha Daily Herald. Tibbles had lived among the Indians on the frontier, fought against slavery in Kansas, and scouted for the Union during the Civil War.
This was this big, giant, raw-boned man whom only the American West seems to spawn these kinds of characters, who saw the world often in very melodramatic terms, and he was never happier when he had a really great cause to go after, a really great story.
Thomas Tibbles was about to be handed the most sensational story of his career, and from the least likely person in the world. His visitor that night was the commander of the Department of the Platte and the most celebrated Indian fighter in America, General George Crook. Crook had engaged Indians in battle, but he also sat cross-legged with them in their lodges and smoked the pipe.
Once an Indian had dealt with Crook, he knew he was dealing with someone he could trust. Crook never minced words. He was blunt with them. Even his most bitter enemies respected him, and they knew they could take his word.
What Crook told Tibbles that night would soon be quoted all over America. During the quarter century that I've been on the plains in government service, I've been forced many times by orders from Washington to do most inhuman things in dealing with the Indians. But now I'm ordered to do a crueler thing than ever before. I would resign my commission if that would prevent the order from being executed, but it would not. Early Sunday morning, with the words of the general ringing in his ears, Thomas Tibbles half ran, half walked the 4 miles to Fort Omaha, where he met General Crook's prisoners.
He gets to the fort and he sees 3 lodges. And inside those lodges are the remains of this fractured, struggling, despondent, hungry, sick, weary group of 29 Ponca men, women, and children. And they're going to be rounded up and herded back to the Indian Territory. It's a death sentence.
With the help of an interpreter, Standing Bear told Thomas Tibbles his story. It began early that winter in Indian Territory when Standing Bear's 16-year-old son, Bear Shield, came down with malaria. Before his death, Bear Shield begged his father to take him home to the Niobrara and bury him with his Ponca ancestors. He was my only son, Standing Bear said. What could I do but promise? In January of 1879, Standing Bear and his small clan left Indian Territory and set out on a 600-mile journey back to Nebraska. What they were doing was illegal, so they kept out of sight. They walked north into the wind, sleeping in haystacks at night, eating remnants of corn from frozen fields. They avoided towns, but encountered many small homesteads.
The white people helped us very much. They showed compassion for us. They gave us bread, coffee, and flour. There were 2 houses that didn't help, but it looked like they didn't have much themselves.
On a cold morning in early March, shocking news spread throughout the Omaha reservation. A ragged band of Ponca had arrived the night before and were camped nearby. Their journey had taken 62 days. The Omaha people gave their cousins food and invited them to rest. Standing Bear and his clan were just 100 miles away from the place where the Niobrara flows into the Missouri, just a few days away from home. They were just beginning to recover when General Crook sent his soldiers to arrest them and take them to Fort Omaha. The plight of the Ponca appeared in the April 1st edition of the Omaha Herald. It featured a quote from medicine man Buffalo Chip. "I have been told since the Great War that all men were free men, and that no man can be made a prisoner unless he does wrong. I have done no wrong, and yet I am here a prisoner. Have you a law for white men and a different law for those who are not white? The power of the press changed everything. Religious leaders of Omaha, Christian and Jewish alike, rallied around Standing Bear. They sent a telegram to Washington asking the president to set the Ponca free. The Omaha tribe petitioned the U.S. government to allow the Ponca to come and live with them. They are our brothers and sisters, our uncles and cousins, and although we are called savages, we are willing to share what we possess with them if they can only be allowed to return.
Nobody had anything but good to say about them. Everyone understood why they were going. They had the coffin there in the wagon.
Meanwhile, from his house on the hill at Fort Omaha, General Crook could see the ragged tents of his prisoners on the parade grounds below.
His orders were to turn their faces south and get them on back to Oklahoma before word gets out among these other tribes that, hey, Standing Bear and the Ponca got to go home. Those were his orders. He decided he wasn't going to do that. He decided that he was going to try and find a way, and maybe this would be the only opportunity he would have, to do the right thing.
May 1st, 1879. Weeks of newspaper publicity and secret negotiations have paid off. At the district courthouse in Omaha, Nebraska, a remarkable trial is about to take place. An Indian chief is suing a famous Army general for his freedom.
There was a lot of buzz. There were people coming to see what this was all about. Some people came to watch these very prominent attorneys in action. Others were curious and wanted to see about Standing Bear. They'd been reading about him in the newspapers, and they decided to come look and see what this all meant.
Few people in a courthouse realized that General George Crook, working behind the scenes with reporter Thomas Tibbles, has engineered the trial as a way to free his Ponca prisoners.
Up until this time, Crook, while sympathetic to the Indians, believed, like most soldiers did, that the only solution would be a military solution. The Indians had to be completely defeated in the field, and then you could start uplifting them and integrating them in society. But the Standing Bear case showed him that there was an alternative.
And so you have an incident that involves a very few people. But from that incident is a big question.
This was just a question that had hung over our country for the 103 years of its existence. Who are these people, and what do we do about them?
After the Civil War, the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution granted citizenship to anyone born in the United States, except the Indians. As General Crook put it, the only people in this country who have no rights under the law are the original owners of the soil. Standing Bear had attracted powerful allies among both whites and Indians. Joseph LaFlèche, chief of the Omaha tribe, sat in a courtroom with his daughter, Suzette. Her Omaha name was Bright Eyes. She had been educated in the East and spoke fluent English. She would soon play a key role in Standing Bear's crusade for justice.
She wasn't a person to sit back where social issues were concerned, you know. Maybe she was one of the first Indian feminists that stuck her neck out and did what she was supposed to do, you know.
Two prominent Omaha attorneys, John Webster and A.J. Poppleton, chief counsel for the Union Pacific Railroad, offered to defend Chief Standing Bear pro bono.
They were the top attorneys in Nebraska in their day. So for them to take on this case is significant and would influence the court and would influence everyone.
Standing Bear entered the courtroom dressed as a chief, with a wide belt of beads at his waist and a necklace of bear claws. Around his shoulders rode General Crook's aide-de-camp John Bork. Standing Bear wore a blanket of vivid red trimmed with blue stripes. This was his council blanket, which he wore whenever he was to speak officially for his people. There was no jury. Federal District Court Judge Elmer Dundee alone would decide the case. The question before the judge was simple. Standing Bear had been arrested for leaving his reservation. Did he have the right to challenge his imprisonment? Did he have the right to habeas corpus?
And the key passage is, any person can file a writ of habeas corpus. It doesn't say anything about being a citizen. The law does not use the word citizen. It says any person can file or sue for a writ of habeas corpus. So the only question before you right now is not whether Standing Bear is a citizen of the United States. The only question before you is whether or not Standing Bear is a person.
I don't think they were questioning whether he was human, but whether he was deserving of the same rights as a white person.
Now, he shouldn't have to prove that because he was born in this land and his people had been in this land long before other people had come to the land that becomes the United States. But nevertheless, this is the legal system in which he finds himself, and he has to operate.
On the witness chair, Standing Bear argued that he had long been walking the white man's road. He was a farmer. He had built a log house. He had even become a Christian.
In my life, I cannot believe that Standing Bear would ever abandon his traditional belief, because it was ingrained in all of our people in those days, even me. But I became a Christian, and I believe that Standing Bear accepted Christianity because it encompassed all of the teachings that our people had.
I think he was trying to show that he could still live a civilized life, but at the same time, he didn't have to give up being Ponca and who he was.
He didn't want any tractors. He didn't want any handouts. He didn't want any welfare. He just wanted to go home and be a self-sufficient, independent farmer.
The hours passed. The attorneys argued the fine points of the law in a language he didn't understand. Finally, Standing Bear had enough.
Lewadi onyati. You brought me here. What have I done? It seems in this world I have nothing.
After 2 days, Judge Dundee adjourned court. As Thomas Tibbles later wrote in his memoir, Standing Bear asked if he could make a final statement. He held out his hand and paused for a moment. Then he spoke directly to the judge.
Nombe te hihate ewakigumbaji. My hand is not the same color as yours. If I pierce it, I shall feel pain. If you pierce your hand, you too will feel pain. The blood that flows will be the same color. I am a man. The same God made us both.
When he finished, there was a fairly long, hushed silence, and then you could begin to hear some sobbing, some crying coming from the back of the courthouse. The judge was emotionally overcome, and even General Crook. General Crook burst up from his bench and rushed over to Standing Bear to shake his hand.
He was saying to the court and to the world, I'm a human being. Respect me. this is the key to the whole thing, is a matter of respect.
Judge Dundee adjourned court on a warm spring evening on the 2nd of May. He would spend the next 10 days pondering his decision. What exactly did it mean to be a person? The judge consulted a dictionary. Webster describes a person as a living soul, a self-conscious being, he wrote. This is comprehensive enough, it would seem, to include even an Indian. Standing Bear had convinced the judge that he was no longer a ward of the government, that he was a free man entitled to 14th Amendment rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that he was a person in the eyes of the law.
Standing Bear didn't beat the U.S. government at the Little Bighorn, or at Sand Creek, or at Wounded Knee. He defeated a general of the United States Army in a federal courtroom on the corner of 15th and Dodge.
The chief thanked the attorneys who had defended him so skillfully. To A.J. Poppleton he gave a sacred headdress. To John Webster he presented his engraved tomahawk. I have found a better way, he told him. Then Standing Bear vanished.
It was fulfilling a promise to his son. It wasn't so much a political statement. It was a statement of a man of honor saying, this was the promise I made and this is the promise I will keep. And isn't that where the biggest political statements start? From a personal commitment, from a personal belief.
Standing Bear's victory sparked controversy across America. Out west, where Indians were still called savages, people were alarmed. The Rocky Mountain News warned that tribes would soon flee their reservations and become a body of tramps moving without restraint. The New York Times, on the other hand, called it the most notable trial ever brought in the West, for it made the Indian as free as a white man if he chooses to accept the conditions of civilization. Standing Bear paid a price for his victory. To be as free as a white man, he and his small clan had cut themselves off from government support and from the rest of their tribe.
Standing Bear jumped ship. Standing Bear, in the eyes of our elders, made a decision to leave his people, to leave the Ponca ways, to cut relationships, to be a white person.
I don't think Standing Bear purposely left his people to get away from the hard times they were going through. He done it for a promise to a dying son. And I admire Standing Bear for what he done. I think he didn't do no wrong. If he could have come back to his people, I think he would have came back, but the government wouldn't let him.
He suddenly was a man without a country. It was illegal for him to go back to the Indian Territory and rejoin the other Ponca because he had disassociated himself from the tribe. It was illegal for him to go back after what he had said in court. And it also meant, according to the law, that he could not go back to the traditional homeland, the confluence of the Niobrara and the Missouri, because that land was owned by the Lakota, and he could be arrested as a trespasser.
Once again, Thomas Tibbles came to the rescue, proposing that Standing Bear go on a human rights crusade to the cities of the East.
By the time you get to the late 1870s, particularly on the East Coast, you're going through a transition in attitudes towards Native Americans. And the further you're away from Native Americans, the more sympathetic that attitude is.
In the fall of 1879, with funding and testimonials from the leading citizens of Omaha, 4 crusaders embarked on a journey. Thomas Tibbles, Chief Standing Bear, Suzette LaFlèche, and her brother Francis.
You have these people taking a train from Omaha, crossing the Missouri, crossing the Mississippi, and starting to hit the great cities of the East. They get to the Palmer House, one of the most elegant places west of New York. This beautiful, legendary hotel in Chicago. And imagine Standing Bear being at the Palmer House, where the floor of the barbershop is all silver dollars. It's a silver floor filled with silver dollars. This is a man who walked from Oklahoma to South Dakota. And here he is dining at the Palmer House.
In living rooms and drawing rooms, Standing Bear and Suzette met the people who called themselves Friends of the Indian. Many had been at the forefront of the anti-slavery movement. But now, that battle was won.
Then comes the Standing Bear case. And so this galvanizes them back into action. And you'll see some of the very same people in the closing period of the abolition movement picking up with the early days of the Indian rights movement.
Suzette LaFlèche, known by everyone as Bright Eyes, had only one good dress made of black silk, which she took from city to city. Her shining black hair was fastened neatly in a braid, wrote a reporter for the New York Daily Tribune. She speaks English with a quaint simplicity and force. Suzette's autograph book filled up quickly with the names of influential Americans: Ralph Waldo Emerson, Oliver Wendell Holmes. The poet Longfellow signed her autograph book with a few lines from Hiawatha and the words, "Fare thee well, O Minnehaha."
She started off as a very timid, a very shy, a very meek personality, a very tiny woman who suddenly was on stage looking at hundreds of strangers and was overwhelmed by it. But the more she did it, the more confident she got, the better she got. She became very passionate about the cause.
By all accounts, Standing Bear enjoyed himself immensely. "When I sat down at a table for the first time," he said, "I watched what the others did and kept just a little behind so I would make no mistake about the white ways." On October 29th, at a Boston hotel, 2 telegrams arrived. One was for Standing Bear. Back in Indian Territory, his brother Big Snake had left the reservation to trade horses with his Cheyenne friends.
They felt like they could travel once again and go. We call that ugasha. You want to go someplace, you want to travel. Well, that meant that you could go now.
Standing Bear was free to go, but his brother was not. Few realized that Judge Dundee's decision applied only to those Indians who had given up their tribal status. As a member of the Southern Ponca tribe, Big Snake had no rights under the 14th Amendment. He was arrested for leaving the reservation and taken back to the Ponca Agency. Big Snake had been in prison before, and he wasn't going to let it happen again. A scuffle broke out, and he was shot between the eyes. On the same day Standing Bear learned of his brother's death, Thomas Tibbles also got a telegram. His wife had died suddenly, leaving him with 2 young daughters. Tibbles wanted to end the crusade, but Standing Bear convinced him to go on. "We both suffer," he said. "But remember all those who suffer and die in that strange land. They need us. We have come too far to quit now." In December of 1879, at Steinway Hall in New York City, 1,000 people came to hear Standing Bear and Bright Eyes. A society matron named Helen Hunt Jackson was so inspired that she later wrote A Century of Dishonor, the first book to chronicle America's injustice toward the Indians. The crusade lasted 3 months. Standing Bear grew tired of playing the noble savage, with his chief's robe, his tomahawk, and his presidential medals. One day he went into a barber shop, got a haircut, and put on a white man's suit. Soon after they returned to Nebraska, Thomas Tibbles and Suzette LaFlèche were married, and together continued their crusade for Indian rights. They hoped to bring Standing Bear's case to the U.S. Supreme Court, where Indians might finally be declared citizens of the United States. But the government preferred to let the whole thing drop. It would be 1924 before Native Americans were finally granted citizenship. When he returned to Nebraska, Standing Bear was once again homeless. He and his small clan settled for a while on an island in the Niobrara River, a tiny remnant of the Ponca homeland claimed by no one.
He was relegated to live on that island for a while, alone. And then part of the triumph was maybe for a while he was forgotten. Maybe nobody did see the relevance in what he had to say. But it seems like right now, doesn't it? There's proof that it does matter. And what he said is living. What he said is powerfully profound in the present, not in the past.
Late in the summer of 1890, 11 years after a federal judge set him free with nowhere to go, Standing Bear received an allotment of land, 297 acres, hugging a bend on the west bank of the Niobrara River. He died there in 1908. But his story was not over. It would continue on in the lives of those who followed.
That one's pretty big though, see him? See him right there.
And look at that one, right by the herd over
Yep,
there.
look at him walking
They're
slowly
huge.
A small herd of bison graze on the old northern Ponca homeland, near the cemetery where Janet Size's grandparents are buried. This is Standing Bear country. This is where the footsteps lead. For the northern Ponca people, this is home. Janet Size grew up in Omaha, but every summer she and her little sister came back to the Niobrara to visit their grandparents.
Sometimes the train would be coming in, and their wagon and their horses would be there tied. But boy, that was great. We just couldn't wait to get here.
Here, Janet says, she felt that she belonged in a way that never happened in a city.
I was called a dirty Indian. I mean, I remember a little girlfriend's mother slamming the door in my face. I was about 7 years old, and I was thinking, you wouldn't say that if you saw my grandma's house.
It was a tough time to be Northern Ponca. Standing Bear's victory had given his descendants freedom from government control, but had taken away most of the government's support. Janet's grandparents struggled to make a living on a few acres of land. In 1962, Congress took the final step and terminated the tribe. In essence, the Northern Ponca no longer existed.
It was just, I don't know, it was just, you kind of drifted. And religiously, I also drifted at the same time. I didn't have any connection.
For 30 years, the Northern Ponca were a people without any tribal status at all. Then in 1990, Congress restored the tribe. To celebrate, the Northern and Southern Ponca held a powwow in Standing Bear country. Two fires became one. For Janet Size, it made all the difference.
And I think that with the restoration, we brought back a lot of people again who were proud then to be Ponca.
Hundreds of miles south in Ponca City, Oklahoma, a 22-foot statue of Chief Standing Bear greets the dawn.
It is him saying, look at this hand, it is like your hand. Look at it, see it, deal with it. When I was a kid, I had little toy Indians. They were all on horseback or they were all holding their tomahawks. You know, give one standing in court, standing for his rights. I didn't have that one.
What was once Indian territory is now home to 38 Indian nations, including the Southern Ponca tribe. Here at the fork of the Salt and Arkansas rivers live the descendants of those who stayed behind when Standing Bear left. Their chief White Eagle is buried here. This is their home, a homeland far from the place where their ancestors once lived.
We owe a debt to people who have preceded us. We owe a debt to keep their stories alive and to stem the tide of forgetting, which swallows everything up. Not just forgetting, but making it over in a new way in order to fit the present rather than the past.
I don't think we should forget it because we learn from history and what the mistakes that were made and the policies that clearly didn't work. And now we're in an era of self-determination and self-governance for tribes. And so I think we have to stay focused on the positive and the great things that tribes are doing today. But at the same time, we can't forget about where we came from and what happened over the years.
What does it mean to be a person? In the footsteps of Standing Bear, perhaps it means to suffer and survive.
We always win. We always win. We win simply because we are intact. We win because our spirits are whole. We have grandchildren. We have great-grandchildren. We have generations that depend on us to be strong and to create a way in this world. And we will do that.
Thank you, Grandma.
Funding for this program was provided by the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux Community, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Jane L. Johnson family, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Union Pacific is honored to serve the 7,000 communities in our system, the same communities we call home. Because where we have tracks, we have ties. Union Pacific, proud sponsor of Standing Bear's Footsteps.
To learn more about Standing Bear's Footsteps, visit pbs.org. Standing Bear's Footsteps is available on DVD. To order, call 1-800-PLAY-PBS or visit shoppbs.org.